I'm Vanessa Tyler. Welcome to Sarter TV. We usually associate bullying with kids on the playground, but what about bosses in the boardroom? Author Andrew Faas says there is a bullying culture in some workplaces, and it's coming from the top. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. Bullying. We often associate bullying with children on the playground. You write about bullying in the workplace. What is your reason for writing this book?
Well, actually, there's a variety of reasons, but bottom line is I was a whistleblower, blew the whistle on a corrupt executive. The board chose not to deal with the executive because they were afraid of him. And I allowed my name to be used as the source of the information. And I went through a period of 18 months of sheer hell. My phones were tapped into, my emails were hacked, my friends and associates shunned me. I had a private investigator follow me for months, and it was just a horrible, horrible time. Given my background is throughout my career, I've always developed what I now refer to as psychologically safe and healthy workplaces. I settled this situation to my satisfaction, but I could not find closure. And from my research, that's what most people who are severely bullied go through long after. It doesn't end when it ends. And for me, it was all-consuming, and I wanted revenge. I had symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, which changes your personality. And thankfully, friends and family kind of intervened and said, listen, you need to get rid of all of this negative emotion. And so I had an awakening, and I thought, what better topic to get into was the area of workplace bullying. And I found that there's very little written or discussed about it. Lots about, as you mentioned, about school bullying, but very little on adult bullying. And I would suggest that adult bullying is far more subtle and complex, and people don't talk about it for a variety of reasons. One being, it may be me that's created this situation, or that's just the way it is in the working world. Or if I raise it, I'm going to be considered weak. Where in schools, it's far more overt.
At least you can tell someone in school.
At least you can tell someone in school.
Hopefully. Did you find any satisfaction by being the whistleblower and getting the information out there? Did it help?
Absolutely. We're hearing a lot about whistleblowing relative to what's going on in government and all of these leaks. And the administration are using the leaks as a diversion to the bigger issue in terms of what's the content. And most bullies, when they react to whistleblowers, they try to find the source. They try to find the leak and retaliate against people who dare put their hand up and say, this is wrong, and this needs to get exposed.
Wow, was the source financial? I'm going to leave the bullying thing, the source of whistleblowing, but I'm just curious, was it financial that you had to disclose?
It was wrongdoing, and I can't really get into the gory details, but but it was severe enough that it ended with the executive and a number of others being invited out of the company.
Who would benefit most from your book? And also I'll ask you about your personal success story.
Yes, and the book is geared towards changing organizational cultures. And Oscar Wilde put it so well when he said, it's the prisons that need the reformation, not the prisoners. So the bulk of my book is dedicated to changing the transforming the organizational culture, and that actually has led to the work that we're now doing with Yale University. And the initiative is called Emotion Revolution in the Workplace. A lot of key executives kind of shudder when they hear that word. We don't want a revolution in the workplace. What I outline and what others in the area outline is organizations need to have activists and resistors and defenders in an organization. And organizations need to continually reinvent themselves. And to reinvent themselves, they need input, good and bad. And they need innovation and creativity, but they also, like Wells Fargo, needed more people to put up their hand, raise their hand and say, this is wrong. And Volkswagen and GM, and the list goes on and on and on. And you're a journalist and you've reported on many of these situations in every aspect or segment of our society. Whether it's religion, media, entertainment, manufacturing, it runs the full gamut.
Wow, what powerful examples do you see in those cases? I mean, you don't know for sure, but can you just almost guess those employees were bullied when they were forced to open accounts in other people's names, and or forced to say that this emission is correct? Or do you feel those employees were bullied?
I've spent a fair bit of time talking to people who were former employees of Wells Fargo, and some existing employers and some executives. And what happened, this didn't just come up. This was exposed 4 years ago internally, and it got a bit of press at the time. And what they did is they sent everybody to ethics training. But they didn't change the quota system or the incentive system. So people, after they went through ethics training, had to go back, do the same things that they were doing to be able to meet the targets. So those who did not meet the targets got fired. Those who put their hand up to say, wait a minute, this is wrong, got fired. And then when it was totally exposed, when it blew up, 5,200 people got thrown out and fired. So, they did nothing other than window dress, but kept doing the same thing. And, they're in a situation, and it's a perfect example of how companies can be ruined. They're bleeding customers. And the reason that they're bleeding customers is customers don't trust them. And they started out by putting big ads in newspapers to talk about how great they are in terms of philanthropic efforts, and really turning back the clock in terms of their horse and buggy and all that represents. My advice to some of the ones I've talked to is, wait a minute, you're pissing money away. You first have to regain the trust and respect of your employees, because they're the ones that are going to have to convince the customers that the organization can be trusted. And if you can't get to that point, you're going to continue to bleed customers, and as a result, you're going to go under.
You ask, is your workplace culture a ticking time bomb? What are the signs, and what should employees look for?
Well, on that, that chapter is more geared to senior management and boards of directors, and it really the cultural transformation has to start at the top. And the biggest indicator is whether or not people have freedom of expression, and the quality of what they're hearing. And most executives in toxic work environments, where maybe two or three people at the top make all of the decisions without the input of others in the organization, are at risk of falling the ticking time bomb, like what happened at Wells Fargo. And I say quality of what they're hearing. If they're only hearing good news, they're not hearing it. And if they're hearing people, put up their hand and say, this doesn't appear right, or we're not tracking well on this, or I'm hearing through the grapevine that this is occurring, and it's an organization that has open secrets. So Fox News, Roger Ailes, sexual predator for years, open secret. Fox News said, and they were very right in cutting ties with Ailes. But shortly after that, within 3 months, they had to settle a sexual abuse situation with Bill O'Reilly. That was kept. And from what I understand, the culture hasn't changed much. And we have the same thing in Canada. It's the exact same thing happened with our national broadcaster, CBC, with the John Ghomeshi affair. And what's ironic about all of this, it's not the actual incidences that caused the downfalls. It's the way organizations handled it afterwards. And so I'll use as a comparator Volkswagen and GM. So Volkswagen had the emissions issue. Denial, denial, denial. And who knew what, when, what did they do about it? It's just so poorly handled. They lost, obviously, a lot of brand value. And again, I don't think they can survive in their current form for too much longer. Compare that to GM with the ignition switch issue. And Mary Barra inherited that. She went in front of Congress and took a whacking. But she said, listen, I'm not here to defend what we did. We take full responsibility. I take full responsibility because I'm the CEO, and here's what we're going to do about it. She went back, met with her executive team, and said, listen, we obviously have to fix the emission switch issue. But why were we not aware that this was going on for this long? And if we were aware, what did we do about it? And that's what we have to change. We have to create a culture where people are not afraid to come forward. And people will take responsibility to fix it. Will take responsibility to own up to it. And it's proven well for her. The fact that she's a female does more for switching and moving the needle on diversity than anything. And quite frankly, does more than what Cheryl did with leaning in, which was great. But this was a real life example in a crisis that could have brought that organization down. And that gets back to emotional intelligence. Why is emotional intelligence brought into this? Is women more emotionally intelligent than men, and therefore more capable of going through a crisis like that.
Excellent. Let's hear it for female CEOs and
Yes.
breaking through that glass.
Yes.
In part 2 of your book, you talk about the dynamics of bullying, and you describe CEO bullies, which you've coined CBOs, Chief Bullying Officers. And, that goes right into what you've just been talking about. It's got to be at the top down.
It's usually top down. 70% of bullying is boss to subordinate. And whether that's in a department, so many organizations could have a very good boss who's very enlightened, but within the organization there could be pockets where there are bully bosses or chief bullying officers. I refer to it as kind of the continuum of bullying. So the shareholder bullies the board of directors. The board of directors bully the CEO. The CEO bullies the executive team, bullies the managers bully the employees, and the employees bully their families. And so it's just like it's a continuum, but it's actually a cycle and that goes around, and the impact that has on people and organizations is critical. I don't get into a lot of statistics, and there's a couple that I've been using. One is that according to a Harvard and Stanford study, there's 120,000 deaths a year that is attributable or may be attributable to workplace stress. And bullying is one of the number one bullying or stress factor, unnecessary stress factors. And when you consider that these are premature deaths, it makes it a number one killer.
And not to mention disease, it's probably...
Affects physical health, mental health, and most people who are severely bullied suffer from, to some degree, from post-traumatic stress disorder.
Like what you were explaining.
And which causes alcoholism and other behavioral addiction issues. And if someone has a precondition, physical precondition of something, it has a bearing on that.
Can you talk about the most ruthless abuse of power you've seen? Is there near gangsterism at the top levels? You say they're like gangsters in there, some of them.
Well, some of them, and when you look at the profile of many boards, most boards, it's an old boys network, and there's nepotism involved through friends, not necessarily family, but old buddies, and there's a very rigid line of demarcation in terms of what is management and what is board. And where a CEO and the chair are one and the same, it's not that great a model. It has worked in some organizations, particularly startup organizations that need to be more agile in terms of how they grow their business. But in a mature business, you need to have checks and balances. And we're seeing this in real time on prime time. So the Republican Congress need to take on the role of governance. And they need to show the kind of leadership that is necessary in most organizations that struggle the way the Volkswagens and the GMs and Wells Fargo need to. They need to step in and say, we need to get to the bottom of this, and we need total transparency, and we need to hold accountability.
And this is textbook of what you're talking about, what we're experiencing.
Yeah, what we're talking about. And it perplexes me that given how fragile the checks and balances already are, that this just adds to it. And by they're not taking a leadership role, as companies go down and have gone down, governments have gone down.
It just is, they're almost the board of directors in the sense.
And they are the board of directors, yeah.
Is your workplace psychologically safe? And you talked a little bit about that in the beginning. What does that mean?
In simple terms, it's a culture where there is a minimal amount of negative stress or unnecessary stress. And workplaces are stressful because of competition in the market, customers, and stress is good. And people like positive stress because it challenges them. And most people do want to be challenged. But in organizations where there's not freedom of expression, people are afraid to put their hand up. People are in fear every day when they walk in as to whether or not they're going to be walked out. And I think there's something like 33 states that are at-will states. And that means that the boss can fire them at will. And many of those states, a gay can get married, same-sex marriage, which is legal, on the same day you could be fired. And I've spent a fair amount of time in the Midwest, and I've referred to it as spending time in twilight zone. Talking to people who are constantly reminded that their job is at risk if they do the wrong thing. So toe the line.
There's no
And-
way anyone's going to speak up in that.
In
How
that.
could you?
And you can't, unless the organization that they work for say, forget about whether or not we can legally fire somebody. We want everybody to succeed here, and we're going to do everything we can to make you successful, not figure out a way to get rid of you. And unfortunately, many managers spend more time trying to figure out how to get rid of somebody for a variety of reasons, including bigotry and discrimination. But a number one area is where a boss feels that the subordinate is a threat to them.
Yeah, trying to take its job.
Yeah. And that creates pitting employees against employees, and it just creates it's a horrendous situation. And again, that goes right back to, why is culture so important?
What happens when there is a failure on the part of the corporate boards to expose flaws in a dysfunctional system?
Well, they're at risk of having it exposed in the media or in the courts.
Yeah.
And again, it's something that organizations should take a hard look at what's going on in their organization and smoke out stuff that's going on that they would not want to see on Fox News or CNN or the front page of the New York Times.
How are most boards functioning? Anything wrong with the current way of doing things?
Well, there are a lot of there's been a lot of changes since the financial crisis that puts more responsibility on the board. Most, in my view, can be worked around. And board members haven't assumed the responsibilities that they should have assumed even before the meltdown. I believe that there should be lines of demarcation, but they should definitely be a check and balance. And to be a check and balance, you have to know what's going on. And you have to have access to people working in the business beyond the CEO and the CFO. And you have to ask questions that penetrate where you aren't directing, but you need to really understand what the hell's going on in the business. And not be, if they're spending more time reacting to issues that the CEO can't work around, then they're acting in a crisis management mode all the time.
Interesting point. Need to get out of that boardroom and get into the business.
And not in a directional way, but go in and really understand what's going on in the business. The average age of a board of directors is 63 years old. And there's going to be a change of the guard, and the millennials are going to be coming in. And I just did a piece for boards and directors, and I'm breaking some myths relative to who are these millennials. And what I found is that millennials have more in common with the boomers than we assume. And all anybody has to do as a boomer is look at what motivated them when they were young. And it's no different than the millennials today.
Beautiful. They seem a little more fearless than.
There's some recent research that came out, and they are under more stress than the boomers. We came in and it was the golden age.
Yeah, there's less money and opportunity.
There's less money, opportunity,
money.
More competition. And this piece came out and said that millennials are more depressed than the previous generation, and they are more prone to suicide. Going back to the 63-year-old, He's more likely a full-time director. And the way the world works, way the business world works is very quick. And who would have predicted Uber? Uber on the street and yellow cab in Smithsonian. And board members need to understand all of the dynamics that go on in the world of business generally. And if you stay away from that for too long, there's a best before date. And boards that do not bring in talent and expertise and perspectives from a diversity point of view overall, whether it's gender or generational, they are missing out on a lot. I populated a drugstore chain. We did a management buyout, and we were private for a long time. And operating as a private company offers you a lot of leeway because the shareholder's not constantly looking for their dividend every quarter. Once you make the switch, and once we made the switch to become a public company, we went out to populate our board, and we determined in a strategic way that the board, like our employee population, have to reflect our customers. And drug retailing, 50% beauty. So we're health, beauty, convenience. And 85% of our customers were women. Yet our management team were a bunch of old men. Good, and they were good. They knew how to do things well. But they were making decisions for women, and they didn't have a clue. So we had a couple challenges. One is how do you get more men customers in? So to shift that ratio a bit, and how do you build even further on your core base? Yeah. And so
get more females on the board.
Get more female, and in management. Yeah. And particularly in store management and in pharmacy. And again, it goes right back to emotional intelligence, because in pharmacy, they are the one point of consistency in the health network. So if you have a general practitioner, he's likely to send you to a bunch of specialists, and the specialists all feed the pharmacist the prescriptions. And it's the pharmacist's relationship with the customer that helps them in terms of things like drug interaction or alternatives. Mm. And again, the importance of having women who are more empathetic to someone who is not there because they want to have coffee with you and be entertained.
They're there to get well.
They're there to get well.
Are companies rewarding bad behavior?
Yes. The dynamic is that in toxic environments, it's the bullies who are considered the heroes.
And what fosters such a toxic environment?
Well, it's a variety of things, and it really boils down in most cases to power and control. And any threat to power and control is severely dealt with.
The raising of the hand again.
Raising of the hand, and or if a CEO feels that their CFO is getting more attention from the board than he is or she is, then but it drives that. Short-termism, I think, is one of the biggest factors that come into play. And if you look at average duration of CEOs, and there's been some studies done that indicate that the longer a CEO is in the job, the better the organization performs and the better the culture is. And where a board hires someone to be a turnaround agent, and he's got 3 years to do it, they're going to do it, and they're not going to care about how the work is done.
Well, and you probably don't get a chance to know any of the people there either.
They won't get to know the people. They don't, quite frankly, they don't care about the people.
Yeah.
All they care about is just getting the results, and then they're out of there.
What should CEOs do to set the tone to avoid that kind of workplace that you're talking about?
Don't be a bully.
Yeah, don't be a bully.
Somebody asked me a question, what was my biggest learning experience? And my biggest learning experience was when I was called out for being a bully. I was 26, working for Canada's largest food retailer, and youngest vice president. And I was cocky, and I observed how everybody else was getting ahead. And I behaved in that manner. One day, Bob McCutcheon, who is the executive vice president, big guy, comes in, darkens my door, sits down, starts stoking up a pipe, and says to me, "Son, I have a problem. I've got this young manager, he's doing this, he's doing that, and I went on and on. And he didn't use the word bullying, but that's what he meant. And he said, and I'm so perplexed as to what to do. And I said, well, I'd fire the SOB. So he takes a long drag from his pipe, and he said, well, son, that's my dilemma. You're the SOB I'm talking about.
Wow.
Now, thankfully, he did not follow my advice, and I went on to enjoy a 23-year career with them. But it taught me that respect is a far more powerful motivator than fear.
What happens when whistleblowers are considered traitors?
Well, they're usually forced out of the organization, and your terminology is dead on. It's when a whistleblower is viewed as the traitor. And I devote a fair bit of time to whistleblowing because I can directly relate to it. I haven't gone through it. And I encourage people to become whistleblowers, even though it involves risk, because the reward is far more important than the risk. And I challenge particularly students. I do a lot of talking to students. And I ask them, basically say to them, at some point in your career, you're going to be either a bully, you're either going to be targeted and or you're going to be a bystander. And you have choices to make. And the biggest choice you're going to have to make is in your position as bystanders. Because you have the ability to save someone's career. You have the ability to save somebody's family unit. You have the ability to save an organization. You have the ability to prevent someone from committing or attempting suicide. You have the ability to prevent mass murder. And never, ever regret having to say that you could have. And by being a bystander, not being a bystander, but by becoming a resistor, a defender, and an activist. And do it in a safe way. And do it in a factual way. And when you see someone who is acting out of the norm, go to them and just say, I noticed you're a bit off recently. Is there anything I can do to help you? Because being in that position, being targeted and constantly harassed or abused is a very, very lonely place. And many people who go through that feel that it's their fault. I must have caused this, or I'm the only one that's going through this because of I'm maybe doing something that I shouldn't be doing.
What a thing when you said mass murder. How many workplace situations have we heard of in the past? I mean, obviously there's some other issues, but a good issue is that there's been something going on with that employee at work.
Yes.
Oftentimes it could be bullying
Yes.
from the boss.
Yes.
And he comes back in and with a gun, and
Yes.
everybody's at risk
Yes.
at that point.
And what amazes me in when you read about all of those instances, what comes out afterwards are the red flags. And the German Air disaster, I asked the question, in that situation, who was the villain and who was the victim? Now, he obviously was the villain in the act, but could he have also been a victim? And I think it behooves organizations where this occurs that they seriously ask themselves that question, because in most cases, I think they would find that the organization and the bully is also the victim or villain.
We talked a little bit, I think, at the top about the emotion revolution in the workplace. That is something that you talk about, and that's really going hand in hand what you're saying right now.
Yes, and what it stemmed from is work that Yale did with understanding how students feel about their school life, and stress, boredom, and tired came out as the top stress factors. But when they peeled the onion on that, they found out that standardized testing was the #1 stress factor in the school system, with students and teachers. And when we peeled back the onion a bit further on it, found that curriculum had shifted to a degree that teachers were spending more time teaching kids how to pass a test versus teaching kids how to learn. And that's given rise to people looking at curriculum in a totally different way. The parallels to organizations is uncanny, particularly on how employees are assessed. So they go through this annual performance review, and it's loathed by both the manager and the employee. It's a once-a-year event. And everybody's uncomfortable, and it's very ambiguous, it's very subjective, it can be manipulated to become a tool or it's used to get rid of people. So compare that to testing in schools, assessing in the workplace. So we're out to validate some of our hypotheses on the unnecessary stress factors. We've got a 20,000 person survey that is almost complete, that will come out in October, and it asks four questions. How do you feel about the work you do, i.e. the tasks? How do you feel about the relationships you have at work? And then how do you feel about the organization?
And why should employers care how you feel? Come to work. What do I care how you feel?
Well, I'll answer that by giving you the fourth question. The fourth question: to what extent do you feel that you're working to your full potential, including innovation and creativity? And what are the barriers to your being able to work to your full potential? Now, Gallup polling shows that 70% of North American workers are not engaged. And a not engaged employee, according to some algorithms that mathematicians have used, will represent a lost opportunity in performance of 13%.
So it affects the bottom line.
It affects the bottom line. But more importantly...
So that's why they should care.
That's why they should care. But socially as well. 120,000 people dying. Like I say to the students, everybody here's a bully, a target, and or a bystander. And they have people in their families who are going through things, and that should resonate with them. So I'm somewhat optimistic, and Dick Cheney gave me my reason for optimism, because he's kind of considered the Darth Vader of politics. But he became a gay rights advocate. You know why?
His daughter.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very true.
And so we're combining emotional intelligence, which is really understanding how you feel, or I feel from a self-awareness perspective, and how you feel, and relate that to how people behave. And emotions drive decisions, emotions drive behaviors, and emotions can be controlled in a positive way. But we're coupling it with the ethic of reciprocity that everybody learned in kindergarten. Do unto others would
Do unto as you want them to do unto you.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I love that. Everything you need in life you learned in kindergarten.
Everything you need in kindergarten, and if people can reflect, when they are having a critical discussion with an employee, or struggling with an employee, or an employee is struggling with their boss, that you need to use emotional intelligence, but don't be emotional. Just indicate how you feel, why you feel the way you do, and what you can do together to switch that bad feeling into a good feeling. And we're building a management system called the Covenant that addresses just that. And it kind of forces those critical discussions using a framework that is not ambiguous, it's not subjective, it reduces surprises, it reduces or eliminates excuses, and it makes people feel that these discussions are meant to help versus to get rid of.
That was my next question. Can a workplace be everything to the workers? All the things you talk about, the creativity, the things in the covenant. Do you think many businesses will adopt the covenant?
Yes, I've applied it, for 40 plus years, and it works. And it works on all fronts. So it works you can apply that covenant to every stakeholder. You can apply it to board members, you can apply it to the executives, to the janitor, you can apply it to your vendors, and it's a simple value proposition.
You gave a statistic earlier. My question is, what is the percentage for American workers that are not engaged at work? And you gave that. Would you say, was that 70%?
70%, and even of that 70%, 23.5% are actively not engaged. So that they're just sitting at a seat, waiting for something to happen.
And you talked a little bit about your work survey. When will that be completed? You're
Actually,
in the
it's pretty much completed now, and so we're going into the analytical stage. We've assembled a group of influencers from a variety of sectors to come into Yale, and we're going to present some preliminary findings to them and solicit their reactions, as well as give some stories about what's occurred in their organizations, good and bad, that touch on our findings.
The back half of your book, you offer solutions about ways that we can effectively deal with this issue.
My advice is to people who are targeted, obviously. And notice I don't use the word victim, because it starts with the person being targeted. And my first book was actually called The Bully's Trap. And the reason it was called The Bully's Trap is people fall into a trap. The target becomes someone that the bully wants them to become. So through harassment and abuse and constant badgering, a solid employee becomes a poor performer with a bad attitude.
Wow.
and then therefore goes from a victim to the villain in the eyes of the corporation. And the target has given the bully the ammunition to do what they do with him. So advice to people who are targeted: don't fall into the bully's trap. Now, there are a lot more ideas, but that's a key one. Also, advice in terms of coping, and the best way and to deal with the situation is not to deal with it alone. And ideally, they should go to somebody in the organization that says that they can trust.
Would that be HR? Are they effective these days?
In over 80% of the cases, they're part of the problem versus part of the solution. And I've had human resources as part of my portfolio for the bulk of my career. And I've always maintained that the human resource person should be assigned and be held accountable for and responsible for the integrity of the culture, the same way that the CFO is held accountable and responsible for the numbers. But unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, they are not considered safe zones to go to.
And then notice a lot of the more modern companies today are instituting those types of different titles, whether it was CLOs or something like that, which is interesting.
Yeah, and it's just a name.
It's just, that's true if they don't do the work effectively.
Yeah, exactly.
You answered this a little bit. On the reverse, what are the factors that can get employees to contribute to their maximum potential? And on the reverse of that, what are the factors that can restrict and restrain employees?
Well, and that's what we're going to find out in greater detail with the survey, because we're asking what are the barriers to your being able to work to your full potential. And the advice I give to people, because they read my book and listen to my talks and say, but I'd love to apply it, but in my organization I can't. And my reaction is, does someone work for you? And usually they have 1, 2, 3 or more people working for them. And I said, well, why can't you be a role model for creating psychologically safe workplaces in your department? And I'll guarantee you that you're going to be successful at it. And by being a role model, people come to you and say, what are you doing? And so, yes, they can be.
And my last question to you in this portion is the work of your foundation. This is all part of your foundation work?
It is. It's part of it, and it's now become the major initiative. But it was founded 12 years ago, and we focus on health, education, and basic research. We are the one of the top, if not top, funders for Israel Cancer Research Fund. And the reason for that is I have leukemia, and given a 6-year life sentence, and through the research done by a scientist that was funded by Israel Cancer Research, 12 years later I'm alive, living a normal life, and it's because of one little pill that I take that's a forerunner to other drug therapies that target the cancer cell directly without harming healthy ones. And without discovery, these kind of drugs will not come, or therapies will not come onto the market. With these with basic research, scientists are now saying that chemotherapy and radiation, as we now know it, will be a thing of the past within a decade.
That would be terrific.
Can you imagine?
And so they'll be customized, more customized.
Through customized diagnosis or individual diagnosis, coupled with this individualized treatment, customized with the type of drug that zeroes directly in on. Yes, and so, but there will be no basic research if there's no funding. And governments and big pharma don't fund it to the extent they should. So obviously we do a lot of lobbying. to get government funding for this. But short of that, we have to go out and get people and foundations like myself to support it. And thankfully, we're getting great response because, again, like bullying, everybody can relate to it because everybody's been touched by it in one way or the other. For sure. Our focus on creating psychologically safe workplaces has kind of taken an exposed position, should I put it. But the other groups we support have the benefit don't have the benefit of me being on their board because I hate board politics, but have the benefit of my input on directionally where we should look, but more importantly, support and speaking about them as an ambassador so that we can raise even more money.
Well, thank you very much for participating and talking with us, and thank you for your work, all of your work.
Well, thank you. Pleasure to be on.
On Sartor TV, where innovative thinkers come to share their ideas. I'm Vanessa Tyler. Thank you for watching.